You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 154. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
One of the things that I like to do, especially when starting in a new place, is to give time for people to build relationships, with me, or if they're not with one another, or teams, to give opportunity for informal conversations and building relationships. And in that setting, helping me to observe and try to listen. I think listening is one of the biggest things that I've learned in this season of ministry, and in actually the last 4 or 5 years of ministry, is that listening is such an important skill.
Today we have a conversation with Beth Marshall. You're going to experience a thoughtful, reflective individual who invites you not only to think and reflect on your own, but go on a journey with her as she contemplates how God is working in her life and the places that God has gifted her and how those things are coming to life in this season of ministry. So let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode by going to the podcast page at transformingmission.org/podcast and follow the link to episode 154. Without any further wait, here's our conversation with Beth Marshall.
Beth, welcome to LeaderCast.
Thank you.
Let's just get started with some kind of introduction. Would you tell us who you are and what you get paid to do?
Yes, I'm Beth Marshall, and I get paid to be the pastor at Lockbourne United Methodist Church.
The question we ask everyone, and this is part of the center of our whole conversation, is what does being a disciple of Jesus mean to you?
For me, the crux of being a disciple of Jesus is being in relationship with Christ. So in the book of Mark, there's a part where Jesus asks his followers to come to him before he sends them out. So he says he called them to him and then he sent them out. And so that's really the crux of, for me, being a follower of Christ, is to be in relationship with him and then being sent out by him to the world in whatever framework he wants to use me. So that's really a crux of it. I think all of ministry flows from that relationship.
Well, part of how we know that you live out your discipleship, it's the way all of us do, is that God's created us uniquely, and we're all gifted with strengths or talents. And part of the work that Sarah has done is around Clifton strengths. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, what are your top 5 strengths?
So my top 5 strengths are ideation, intellection, learner, input, and connectedness. So they all fall with, most of them, except for the last one, fall within that strategic thinking area of leadership.
So thank you for saying that, because for our folks that are listening, they might hear those words and go, What's that all about? And you just set the tone for part of who you are and how God has created you. So in our conversation today, we want to focus in on your intellection talent theme. And those of you that listen every week, I say this all the time, we can't really separate out your intellection theme from the rest of who you are. But I want our listeners to be able to hear how Gallup defines that specific talent theme, so that as we're having conversation, they can go, oh yeah, there it is again. Oh yeah, there it is again. So for our listeners, here's how Gallup defines intellection. They say that people exceptionally talented in the intellection theme are characterized by their intellectual activity. They are introspective and appreciate intellectual discussions. They go on to say, you like to think, you like mental activity, you like exercising the muscles in your brain, stretching them in multiple directions. This need for mental activity may be focused. For example, you may be trying to solve a problem or develop an idea or understand another person's feeling. feelings. The exact focus will depend on your other strengths. So my question for you in that is, when do you do your best thinking?
Well, I don't think that there's a specific time for me that I do my best thinking. Sometimes I can start thinking about something in the middle of cooking dinner, or one of my children has said has sparked an idea that made me think about something else, or I might be watching a movie that's like, oh, that kind of turns on another light in another area. So much to the chagrin of my children, I'll get lost in thought frequently. They're saying, Mom, hello. And so I think it happens at different times and in different ways and in different avenues. So there'll be times that I'll have an idea, and of course, if I can't think about it right then, it'll come back later, and I'll just tend to think about it. Sometimes when I'm getting ready in the morning, that's usually when I'm the most uninterrupted, when people aren't interrupting me with what they need. It's getting ready in the morning, and kind of my brain goes on automatic pilot and getting ready for the day. Then things, sometimes start to process during that time.
So, Beth, I think it's interesting that even when we ask you the question, you stop to think about it.
Yeah.
Part of Gallup's research has shown us that there are 4 needs that followers have that they look for in their leaders. One of them is building trust. They build trust, they show compassion, provide stability, and they offer hope. And what we're learning, and I think we already knew it, but what is being affirmed is that every leader does this in a unique way. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about leaders, the definition that we're using really comes from Brené Brown. It's anyone who takes responsibility for recognizing the potential in people or in processes and has the courage to develop that potential. Mm-hmm. So you've given us an idea of how you think about being a disciple. Mm-hmm. You have told us about your strengths. I mean, you have those lists. So thinking about, as Sarah's already said, your intellection talent and leadership at this season of life and service, we want to explore some ways and about these needs of these followers. And how does this intellection show up in building trust, showing compassion, provide stability, and offer hope? So that's going to be part of the conversation.
Sure.
The first one is building trust. So how is your ability to carefully analyze the thinking of others, respectfully give you the opportunity to give your honest opinion, how has that helped trust?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I like to do, especially when starting in a new place, is to give time for people to build relationships, with me, or if they're not with one another, or teams, to give opportunity for informal conversations and building relationships. And in that setting, helping me to observe and try to listen. I think listening is one of the biggest things that I've learned in this season of ministry, and in actually the last 4 or 5 years of ministry, is that listening is such an important skill. And so I'm trying to learn how to listen well, not just listening to what people are saying, but what their behavior are, what their actions are, and trying to understand where people are coming from. I think when people feel heard and when they feel understood, that builds trust. And so throughout this, this season of ministry, I've tried to do that. I have not always done it great, but that's something that I have tried to do, and to be able to use that intellection strength to think through, not to assume, not to make assumptions or presumptions about what people are thinking and doing. For me to be aware of that just because I assume something doesn't mean that's true, but to be able to think through what people are saying and doing, to think about where they might be coming from and trying to take their perspective. And I think when people know that you're doing that, when you're seeking to hear and understand them and to know that they are seen and heard, then that builds trust. So intellection is something that I'm I think I've been able to use to help build that trust when they know that I'm asking questions and trying to remember some things, where so-and-so, my cat was sick, well, that means that it's real important that, cats are an important part of her life. So, those kinds of things. So they know that they are seen and heard.
Listening to you, Beth, I'm loving hearing how you're expressing a talent theme that I think on its own, so many people, the image that comes up is someone who's sitting at a desk with a book in front of them and thinking in isolation, and looking at your top 5 and number 5, your connectedness. For you, that thinking is based in relationship, and how are we in relationship with one another, and what does that look like, and what does it mean? So thank you for what you've already shared with us and with folks. Sometimes our strategic thinking can it's isolated, and we get isolated from that. And so you've expressed it in a way that is integrated and brings life to others. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. As we move on to the aspect of showing compassion, can you think of a time, how or when, sharing your best thinking has helped you to show compassion?
I think it ties in with what I've said before, and it goes on to the next step, where if I know where people are coming from, it helps to put the reins on my strategic thinking in a way, because, I have ideas, and thoughts, and say, oh, this would be a great idea. Let's try this. Let's try this. Let's try this. But the knowledge and awareness of, well, maybe they're not there yet. That's the compassion part, in trying to recognize where they are and to meet them where they are. And that's one thing that I try to communicate. When we talk about reaching out to other people, when we talk about trying to share the love of Christ with others, it's about figuring out where they are first, and figuring out, where they're coming from, so that you can have a more compassionate interaction with them. And again, that's not just sharing Christ with others, but it just even in our relationships with one another. So just recognizing where people are and being aware and thinking about that, where are people, before you go ahead and start with your own plans, to think about where they're coming from first.
So in this season in which we've been in, and I'm going to use the word pandemics. I mean, we're in the midst of several.
Yeah.
You've been providing some stability. I already know that because of who you are and where you're serving. Can you tell us a time or how sharing your thinking has helped provide that stability?
I think a lot of it comes coming from the pulpit, from preaching, sharing that information about what I know about Christ and what I know about my relationship with him, and how that relationship is impacting me during this time, and how God is leading me through one step at a time. I think that's one of the primary ways. And of course, that's a frustration for a lot of us, because you don't have those informal conversations like you normally would have in a normal setting. So we have some informal conversations through phone calls and things like that. But I would have to say a lot of what I'm sharing, these ideas, sharing my thoughts from preaching. And, this is my first year of preaching. So it's really been a joy to be able to share a lot of those thoughts and those ideas and those revelations, to say, well, this is what God told me this week about this scripture, and this is how God is helping me through this. And so helping people to remember the basics of faith when things are all crazy. I've tried to incorporate that every week, and in every conversation that I've been having, is to go back to the basics of faith, which is God loves you, and God is good, and God is good all the time. And so even when it doesn't seem like it, he's still working. And so that reminder for me and for everyone that I'm speaking with, to keep hope and to remember where our foundation rests. It's not on our circumstances, but on God.
So you just mentioned hope.
Yeah.
and you're already doing that. Some folks, when they think about the intellection talent theme, I've heard the word, oh gosh, folks with the intellection talent theme have wise scrutiny of ideas, that they're great at really thinking through and analyzing and asking questions about the questions. So I'm wondering for you, how or when has your, if I can use the phrase wise scrutiny, and you might change that phrase, your wise scrutiny of ideas created hope for others?
There's been some times when, when I've been thinking about the message for the week, or sometimes on my walks, things will happen. I guess I can give an example of ways that common objects that we use in our lives, like Jesus used common objects all the time to help connect ideas and thoughts, to people. And so there was one day I remember walking, and I was thinking about prayer, and the thought of, I had read some reports about how they tried to measure the effects of prayer, like scientifically measure the outcomes. And I remember the thought coming to my head, it's like trying to measure the effects of prayer is like, trying to measure water with a colander, and those kinds of things, again, I are all God-given. It helps bring clarification, and it helps bring concrete ideas to sometimes abstract thinking. And I think when you can connect those things with things that people already know, it can bring hope to them and help them understand a little bit more about things that are hard to understand sometimes.
And so the next time I grab my colander, I'm going to be thinking about you and thinking about prayer and pausing in that moment to pray. And that is a way that, what are the reminders around us of, Jesus is with you and God is present in the midst of whatever you're doing, even when you might be draining the noodles for dinner, and what is happening there. I don't know if you even want to answer this question, because I'm trying to picture you doing this. And if you do this, my guess is you do this in a very gentle way. Do you ever find yourself reframing questions so people can engage in dialogue?
That's something I'm learning to do. I know I have people in my life who ask a question, and then the person doesn't really understand the question, and then that person just continues to ask the same question in the same way over and over again. And it's like, that doesn't help. You need to reframe the question. So maybe I do it without thinking about it, that when they look at me with a blank stare, I automatically reframe the question in a different way, so that they can understand. And I do have an education background. So I was a teacher for many years. And so that may be something that comes naturally that I'm not aware of, that when a student asks a question, it's like, I don't understand your question. Then I just reframe it, trying to think about where they're coming from, in that time.
Yeah. And what I often find myself saying to folks as we have these conversations, sometimes there's so much a part of who we are that until someone points it out, or we stop and, someone asks us a silly question about, how often do you reframe questions? That we go, yeah, I guess I do that, but I don't really think about doing it. I just step into it. And that's because it's a part of who God created you to be. It's a part of your natural talent. And not everyone has the ability to do that. Like you just said around some people just keep asking the same question, and people look at you like, what are you even trying to get at? So thank you for that. Anything else that you would like to share with us about how your top 5 Clifton strengths are fueling your leadership?
I think in the bigger picture, all of those things are working together, which you've already said, how the ideation and the intellection and the input, it's as a strategic thinker, it's very, very easy for me to jump on a new idea, or to start mulling over things and planning a new project from beginning to end without even talking to anyone else about it. And so, but then the connectedness comes in and helps to think about, well, we're all connected in this. So I think that is fueling my leadership a lot, that when I would typically jump in and start planning and doing, I stop and think we need to do this together. And I do believe that that is a skill that God has taught me over time. So that skill was always there. And if I had been the pastor of Lockbourne 5 or 6 years ago, I might have handled things a whole lot differently than I am now. But because of God's wisdom, he has equipped me and trained me and taught me over that time period to say, let's pull in your connectedness strength, before you jump in and start, thinking through plans and ideas without having conversations with other people. As you've said, it can be very isolating thing, but it's better. And I found that to be the case too. It's better when you talk about ideas and think things through with other people so that everybody's on the same page, or at least aware of what page we're on.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Beth, thank you for what you've shared at this point. I'm going to shift a little bit and ask a question here of what courageous decisions are you making right now as a leader?
I think one of the courageous things that we are trying to do is to move into new spaces. So in terms of what worship might look like, especially with the pandemic, leading people into thinking about what does reaching people for Christ look like in this season. It's been challenging for everyone, because we would like to have Bible studies and we'd like to have huge gatherings of people and we want to have events and things that draw people. But unfortunately, that's not an option right now. So we have to stop and think about what we do have. And so one specific area that our church is trying to figure out is how do we move our service online? So we right now have a Facebook page that I'm sharing the message and some prayer on, but the courageous decision we're making now is how can we move that into actually recording our service, and the challenge that brings, for the congregation that, okay, even though there's not a face in the new room, a new person in the room, that still means we still have other people in the room that are going to be listening to this later on. And so that's a courageous decision that we're all making, that I'm inviting the congregation to make with me. That was very scary in the beginning, back in March, when it was, when this was all starting, and we said we have to do something online. What's that going to be? And then I remember my first sermon on Facebook Live thinking, oh my gosh, this is going out to so many people, But again, having that courage to say, you know what, this is scary, but it's absolutely essential that we continue to spread the word of God. And so now extending that courageous decision to the congregation and leading them in that. So I think that for us right now, and for me personally, we're not going to look like every other church, but that's okay. And I firmly believe that God has called each church to be who he has created them to be, just as we as people are. And so to encourage our congregation to say, we don't have to look like the church down the street. We don't have to look like the church that has, all these other things that, if we just have a laptop and, and a microphone, then that's who we are right now, and to embrace that. So that is a courageous, I think, decision for us right now.
It's very good. Thank you. I like that.
Yeah, starting where people are at and with what you have, and not trying to make it more than what it needs to be. And I am just appreciating, Beth, your thoughtfulness. And that sounds silly because we're talking about the Intellection theme, so of course there's thoughtfulness in that, but I mean that sincerely, that it is not, I thought about that. Like, there is a depth of your spirit that I'm experiencing even with you in this moment. So thank you for sharing that with folks and with us today. So as you think about, we've been talking about this pandemic season that we're in. So take it as the pandemic season, take it as the past 3 months, take it as the past 6 months. You decide the time. What do you celebrate God doing in your life and or leadership right now?
I pause because there's so much. Because this has been a time, not just for me, but for a lot of people, that we're being caused to stretch and try new things. Now, for me, I like to try new things. So that's trying new things isn't the issue, but I think in trying those new things is trusting. And I've heard a couple different places about, and probably from here as well, that being able to try something, and then if you fail, it's not the end of the world. You tried it and it just didn't work. And so that's happened a few times where, especially with technology and with some folks that aren't used to working with technology, trying to continue to persevere. So I think over the last 3 to 6 months, that same theme that God is teaching me, sometimes it's best, what God is just asking us to do is to show up. And what I mean by show up, I don't mean just not doing the work ahead of time. It's showing up could look like spending time in preparation for the message. It's not just showing up at church on Sunday with no preparation. But again, I think it's about showing up and just to keep moving and just to keep moving forward and keep moving forward and keep moving forward and to give ourselves grace. So I think those two themes for me, at least, showing up and giving ourselves and others grace during this season, are things that he's teaching me right now, and so I'm celebrating.
You also have learner as one of your strengths. So I'm guessing that all of this is exciting because you're always learning something, whether it's in conversation or ideas or trying something new, you're always learning something.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, in this current season of ministry, one of the things that is most exciting to me is learning how to preach well. So I know that's not the whole part of pastoring, but when I think about, where I am in ministry, this is the first time that I've preached every Sunday. And so looking at how different pastors preach and how they get their message across and how they come about their message, those are all things that are fueling the learner in me right now. That's a focus. And again, I could be learning about a lot of, the other thing I'm trying to learn about is technology and learning how to edit, like you were saying, edit videos and things like that. But I think the primary thing right now for me is learning how to communicate in a way that's effective to people, that brings them closer to God or whatever it is God has planned for them.
Well, I know a little bit about your background, and you've been around some good preachers. I also know that your dad was a pastor or preacher. Has that had any impact on your learning and what you're doing now as a leader? Absolutely.
So I think the pastors the teaching I have sat under, my entire life has given me wonderful foundations to be able to continue. And it's been interesting to hear as I'm preaching words that I know that I've heard, that are part of who I am, that just come out to say, this is what I've heard. And so when I go back and listen to preachers that I've sat under before, I recognize I don't want to say the exact words, but the nature, the delivery, is similar to what I've heard in the past. And so the way that I'm expressing in my preaching is coming out through my experience with them, and that has been such a huge blessing. So yes, definitely, even just the delivery and the style that it's being delivered, it's like, oh, I recognize that.
So are you ready? Are you ready for the rapid fire questions?
Sure, as ready as I'll ever be.
These are 10 fun questions that we do each time. Each time we do it, they're a little bit different, but really the goal is to help our listeners get to know you as a person a little bit more. So Tim's going to get us started with the first question.
Yeah, when you get started every morning, what's your beverage of choice?
Coffee. Well, I should say creamer with some coffee. Creamer and sugar with some coffee.
So it's just not straight black coffee.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
What is your favorite or go-to Bible verse?
And that would have to be Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. That's trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but submit to him in all things and he will direct your path. So that's been my life verse for sure.
That could also be a life verse for Intellection.
Yeah.
What's your favorite season and why?
Oh, it varies between spring and fall because I don't know if it's this season in particular, the colors have been so vibrant. But I love the colors of the fall, but I also love the newness of spring. So it's a toss-up between the both of those.
When did you receive your first Bible?
I honestly am not sure. It probably was when I was a baby because growing up in church, being the pastor's kid, I probably received it, but I don't specifically remember a first time. I do remember getting my third grade Bible. That was like an official type of Bible, but I know I had one before that too.
What do people misunderstand about you?
I can come across at first very quiet and shy and, can sometimes seem very agreeable to anything in my effort to be compassionate and understanding. But there are certain things about me that are non-negotiable. Something that I'll stand up and say, no, that's not how it is. And so that can, my quietness and shyness can seem like, there's nothing there, but there is.
What is the last thing that you read?
Let's see. Funny enough, I'm reading a Brene Brown book right now, The Gift of Imperfection. And I started reading through it really quickly and then realized it's something that I need to process, think through. So I read through it, but then I'm going back now and just reading very carefully, making sure I have time to chew on what I'm reading.
It's funny that you should say that. That book is sitting on my kitchen table, which is my catch-all place. And we all have that one catch-all place in our homes. My kitchen table is. And this morning, the book just fell open. And I'm like, okay, I'll just read what is in front of me. And it was on gratitude. And I thought, sometimes books do fall open. And they're the reminders that we need for that day.
Yeah.
So yeah, great book.
What's your favorite vacation spot or place to relax?
Any place around water. So the beach, I like the beach, but I also like the lake. So any place that I can just sit and look at water and the nature around it is I'm happy in that space.
What is bringing you joy these days?
I'd say the biggest thing that's bringing me joy is being outside. I love to walk and I love to be in nature and hiking and things. So being able to get out of the house and to be by myself and to think and process, as I'm walking gives me that freedom to be able to do that. So that's, this season, like I said, I'm looking out the window right now at the brilliant fall colors, and it's just that's bringing me a lot of joy these days.
What music brings you meaning or peace?
Contemporary Christian worship music is what I usually go to. One of my favorite songs, I'm trying to remember the name of it, that it's been a recent song put out by Bethel Music, but it's about the goodness of God. And so anything that can draw my heart and mind and thoughts to how God is so much bigger than me and what I'm experiencing, that is helpful and meaningful for me.
This is the last one. What is your favorite part of Christmas?
I would have to say Christmas Eve service. In years past, it's probably been watching my family open up, presents. But this past Christmas was my first Christmas leading a worship service in Christmas. And that was extremely powerful to be able to experience that and to be able to celebrate the holiness of the coming of the Christ child. That was a highlight of my year. And so I think that's now my favorite is the Christmas Eve service.
As we circle back, any last words that you want to share with the folks listening to the podcast?
I think the biggest thing for me right now is remembering who we are in Christ, and to remember that relationship. That has just been evident to me over and over again, how important it is that we, that rule that Wesley, stay in love with God is the absolute most important thing. And so to encourage us to continue to do that, to nurture that relationship with God, because I think all of our ministry, all of our life comes from that relationship. So to make that a priority, whatever that looks like.
So, Beth, I want to tell you how grateful I am for you today. One of the things I've heard loud and clear, I mean, you were very clear about your relationship with Christ and how that, but you live that out in relationship to the people around you. You actually start with them and you listen and you care about who they are. The other thing that I learned about you today, which is a gift, and that is just because you listen to those people and you care about them doesn't mean that that's where you want them to stay. You have a place where you want to take them, but you start with where they are and start that journey with them so that they can grow into that. And it's been a real joy to listen to you have this conversation today, to see and experience how you're leading at this time. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend some time with us. And I know that as folks listen to this, they are going to be blessed. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
I hope in this moment you're saying, yep, Sarah was right. I just experienced a thoughtful, reflective individual who invited us into relationship with her and modeled that so beautifully. That's certainly what Tim and I experienced as we sat down to have a conversation with Beth, and I hope that you did as well in listening to this conversation. As we've done the past few weeks, I have a question this week for you, but actually it's not a question. First, there's a challenge, and then I'm going to give you a question. The first challenge is this. I want you to challenge yourself this week as you ask someone a question to reframe that question. Not just for the sake of reframing it and playing a language game with yourself, but I want to invite you to pause and reflect and give thought to how you might reframe the question so that someone may answer it in a way that they might not be hearing you in that first attempt to ask the question. So that's challenge number one. The second one is actually a question. How or where do you do your best thinking? And once you've identified that, here's the challenge. I want you to give yourself the gift this week of spending time or space in that practice, or giving yourself the time on your calendar to actually take the time to pause and do some of your best thinking. We're coming to the end of the year. And so you might think about, what do you celebrate about this year? You might think about, what are you looking forward to in the coming year? Or what goals are you setting for 2021? Recognizing that just like they were in 2020, there may be things that need to shift. What are you looking forward to? Those are just examples. You may have something else that you need to do some deep thinking about. My invitation to you is simply to give yourself the gift of the time to do that deep thinking this week. As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode 154, by going to the podcast page at transformingmission.org/podcast. Now go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.